So this is going to be a bit of a shorter video, related to something I've been working on for a little while. The subject is variance, specifically our interactions with it and our impressions of it. And it just so happens that Joseph Anderson's review of Darkest Dungeon from too many years ago when the game first came out is a perfect example of many of the things I want to talk about. To be clear up front, this isn't going to be some takedown of Joseph's video. I think that his analysis of the game is poor, but that's not the point here. Who knows if he even still stands by any of what he said? Perspectives shift with time, and it's been a long time since this video was released. His analysis, and the commentary he offers, simply present a perfect case study for my purposes. So let's hear it.
Here's an example of how quickly someone can die in this game. I have a Hellion on the front line. She's randomly selected to take a hit, which rolls a massive crit that deals more than 75% of her maximum HP. She's knocked down to death's door, and is then chosen for the next hit and dies. That's at least 3 hours of grinding out done in that moment, and there was nothing I could do about it. This is a way that permadeath hurts the game. It encourages careful, tedious play to minimize any moments like this.
Okay, both before and after this clip, Joseph in this review has a pretty clear negative slant against RNG. I'm for now going to leave alone the implication throughout the video that randomness, or RNG, is a categorically bad thing. I heavily disagree, but whatever, let's just focus on the example. In a champion dungeon, Joseph has one of his Hellions crit for a whopping 32 by a Brigand Bloodletter, and then killed on the follow-up by a Brigand Cutthroat due to the Hellion failing her Deathblow roll, on a 33% chance. This is pretty unfortunate. Doesn't take a genius to preface that. The Bloodletter rolled an attack to target the Hellion, then rolled a crit on a 24% chance on that attack, then the Cutthroat also rolled an attack that would hit the Hellion, and Joseph lost his 67% chance to live through the hit. Quite unlucky. To rub salt into the wound, Point Blank Shot, the move the Cutthroat used, is the only move it has that can roll damage numbers like that. The rest of its kit is focused on damage over time and stress application. The crucial thing here, though, is that Joseph says there is nothing he could do. His character died without any agency on his part to prevent it. Seems vaguely true, the two enemies acted consecutively. Joseph had no possible game actions he could have taken between the crit and the slice and dice for the kill. All because he got unlucky on the enemy crit roll, got unlucky on the enemy targeting, got unlucky on his own dodge roll, and got unlucky with his death's door roll. And this is how a lot of people tend to view particular swings of the dice. In isolation, or in particular streaks that suit the way they want to look at things. The roll history is arranged such that it obscures the elephant in the room, the decisions made that led to the current game state. These decisions are almost always just as important, if not more important, than whatever the random number generator spits out, save for the most ungodly of outlier rolls, which are possible, mind you. An outlier isn't an impossibility. To start with, we can note that a one-shot is not as unlikely as it might first appear. The Brigand Cutthroat's point-blank shot can only target the first position, and has a higher than average chance to crit. We'll let Joseph off the hook for the second element, as it requires googling or going into the game files to know with certainty. This is information that perhaps the player ought to be privy to, but isn't. However, we can still be aware that a critical hit is, in fact, a possibility. An aware player can walk into this encounter and know that with these two enemies left acting consecutively, there is a non-zero chance for a character to die. It's not a likelihood by any stretch of the imagination, but a large part of the skill expression in games like Darkest Dungeon is risk mitigation. You're tasked with reducing your vulnerability to the results of the random number generator, such that its negative swings cannot impact you as negatively, and you're not as reliant on its positive swings in order to succeed. Your decisions are oriented around odds management or expected value, however you define value at that point. This, sometimes, will entail specific game actions undertaken to shore up against worst-case scenarios. You can't always fully account for everything, but the task is trying to account for the game state and its possibilities as thoroughly as you can while still actually progressing it. The enemies do have to die at some point, after all. As you heard, Joseph described this as playing tediously carefully, which is silly for reasons that are beside the point of this video. Let's return to the example. The second matter at hand here is how common this attitude is. My character died, there was nothing I could do. What Joseph is saying here is something that a vast number of people put in similar positions feel when playing games involving variance, right down to the variance of boss move choice in an action game or something like that. The reality is, though, that, like it or not, you have a lot of agency in these games. Chance undeniably plays a role in the outcome, but there are a lot of decisions to be made that can affect potential outcomes. To use Joseph's scenario, we can notice a few things about the game state he cuts to. He has used all 4 of his actions to kill the Fusilier in the back rank and to take off about half of the Bloodletter's health. It's a surprise round, meaning Joseph gets to act with all 4 of his characters before any enemies can act. He took all 4 actions in sequence, then the Fusilier's turn started and it died to Blight before acting, then the character death plays out from the remaining 2 enemy actions. The Brigand Bloodletter is missing a sizable chunk of its hit points, likely from an attack from either the Hellion or the Crusader. The Hellion is also missing a sizable chunk of her hit points, she's on 27 out of 46. The Cutthroat has Blight and the Fusilier died to Blight on its turn start, meaning that the Plague Doctor used Plague Grenade on her turn, as this is the only way that we can get those 2 Blight applications. And finally, Joseph has a whole lot of food in his inventory. So, to reconstruct the game state, first off, Joseph entered the room, saw the surprise, and used all 4 of his actions to create the game state we see. The Brigand Fusilier dying on its turn start to Blight as the enemy turns begin. The sizable missing chunk of HP on the Bloodletter speaks to a hit, probably a crit from the Crusader, as the Hellion likely used Iron Swan to help focus down the Fusilier. This leaves us with the Vestal's action hanging in terms of where it went. It could have been a judgment on the Bloodletter, a heal on an allied target, or a judgment on the Fusilier to help kill him off. If I did the maths some more with some of his trinkets and whatnot, we could probably arrive at a reasonable degree of certainty as to what exactly he used the Vestal for. But in either case, we know, approximately, how Joseph spent his 4 actions upon entering the room. The Hellion attacked the Fusilier, the Crusader attacked the Bloodletter, the Plague Doctor used Plague Grenade on the back 2 Brigands, and only the Vestal's action is left ambiguous. From the looks of things, and please do note I am speculating, Joseph was on autopilot. Enter room, deal lots of damage to backline enemy, clean up frontline. It's pretty much the basic underpinning strategy of Darkest Dungeon regular combats. However, he has a lot of tools at his disposal that could have checked the possibility of a hero death, just with these 4 actions had they been spent differently. Chief amongst these, the cornerstone of all Darkest Dungeon combat that goes conspicuously unreferenced in Joseph's video, stuns. Stunning enemies is extremely centralizing and overly powerful in Darkest Dungeon even today, after the reliability of stuns has been nerfed many times. Joseph is running a party in which all 4 members have a stun. Barbaric Yorp for the Hellion, Stunning Blow for the Crusader, Blinding Gas for the Plague Doctor, and Dazzling Light for the Vestal. The Plague Doctor even has a second one in Disorienting Blast. Now, Brigand Cutthroats are quite stun resistant, but with trinkets that increase stun chance, it's still reasonably reliable. And we know that Joseph is running Blasphemous Vial on his Plague Doctor, one of the strongest trinkets in the whole game in its pre-nerf state where it gave a whopping plus 40% stun chance. This allows her, between Blinding Gas and Disorienting Blast, to reliably stun any part of this combat, either both of the backliners or the Bloodletter. And a stunned enemy, would you believe it, is incapable of acting. The Crusader could have also taken an approximate coin flip on Stunning Blow on the Bloodletter instead of applying damage that, at this immediate turn, isn't actually meaningful. Damage doesn't debilitate in any way, it has no effect until a target is dead. So to say, it only immediately provides you a further step towards lethal range, rather than actually accomplishing anything in the moment. Acknowledgement of the potential danger of a one-shot could have informed a decision on taking that coin flip. Or, knowing that the Crusader almost certainly acted after the Hellion due to the much lower speed, Joseph could maybe have acknowledged that point-blank shot is a move that can only target the first position, and decided to move his Crusader into position 1 with that action instead of trying that stun or the regular strike. Doing this would have made the instant death we see completely impossible. There is, of course, merit to alpha striking enemies during surprise rounds. A dead enemy can't hit you back, saving HP by virtue of never getting struck in the first place. The Fusilier never got to use Blanket Fire, which saved in total between 8 and 20 HP across the whole party, assuming every shot hit. Additionally, by this point, the Brigands are quite fast. It's not unlikely that on the following round, the Fusilier and the Cutthroat would be acting before Joseph's heroes anyway, or at the very least before some of them. There's a world where, considering this, the stun doesn't actually accomplish anything at all, as the Cutthroat just does the same thing, but at the start of the next round instead. But what about a version of events where both the Cutthroat and the Bloodletter are stunned? Bloodletters are really slow, and they'll act quite late generally. Certainly more in line with Joseph's party rather than being faster. I won't go into every single last possible thing Joseph could have done in this very encounter to mitigate this remote possibility, as I think the point has been made. The dude had a lot of agency in what happened in this first round, but didn't respect the potential danger in front of him. This isn't uncommon, and it's easy to do. The Bloodletter could have done any number of things, but this time it rolled point-blank shot, one of the 3 possible options. And you'll notice that this is a manner of phrasing that downplays it still being one of the options. It's a 1 in 3, but it is one of those 3. What I hope is apparent now is that it no longer seems reasonable at all to say that there was nothing he could do. There were, in fact, several things he could have done, and good reasons to have done them. The danger was present and recognizable. Darkest Dungeon does have scenarios in which heroes can die without any possibility of preventing it. But these happenstances are rare, generally only cropping up at the game's absolute hardest points, like when playing on Torchless. The classic example is spider encounters. Get surprised by a group of spiders playing Torchless, and it's quite possible to have a character get stunned, crit twice in a row to Death's Door with a Blight, and then die to the very first tick. It's why damage over time effects are so scary, because they tick at turn start before you can act with that character. Darkest Dungeon is generally a bit more cruel with the potential effects of its variance swings in service of furthering its conceptual focus of stress. But cases of utterly unpreventable character death are distant outliers, mostly, though not entirely, outside of the game's normal difficulty paradigms on any difficulty setting. All of this to say, people are rather prone to downplaying their own agency in games that involve chance. It's easy to do, as getting disadvantaged on low odds is never going to, in itself, feel good, and it sticks out in our minds. Especially since the punishment for a misplay, both terms used loosely here as these things can be hard to determine in complex RNG involving game states, is often varied itself. There's a world where this fight plays out another time and the Bloodletter uses Rain of Whips or Punish instead, or the Cutthroat uses Uppercut Slice or Shank targeting a different hero. There's a version where the Hellion survives the Death's Door check. The ways things could have gone range from innocuous all the way through to the character death we see. In some of the higher roll circumstances, Joseph would have continued on, never really aware of the danger. Similar things happen in all sorts of these games. Sometimes I go to the spin event in Slay the Spire without realizing that it has a chance to kill me, and then it kills me. Usually it doesn't, but a thing you will see is that good players will take this into consideration when choosing their next room if the possible damage is relevant to their game state. This is how skill is expressed in these games, and that's where the engagement comes from. It's not a tedious degree of caution, it is literally the intent of the gameplay loop. There is also one more thing in this situation that goes unexamined. A quite important thing that gives a lot of insight into how Joseph views any given swing of the numbers, or the effects of his choices. The Hellion, as I mentioned, is missing a sizable chunk of HP. If she had only 6 more, she would have lived. The 32 crit would not have taken her to Death's Door, and the Slice and Dice wouldn't have caused a Death's Door roll. I wonder if Joseph ever considered where those missing hit points went. In all likelihood, they were lost to some misplay or unoptimized sequence in some prior fight, or over the course of a series of fights. 2 HP here, 3 HP there, or maybe all in one go, and Joseph didn't manage to fully recuperate the loss before moving on. This hard-to-map space of long-term decisions and their effects is where the player's agency is made most apparent, but also the hardest to discern. Think in Slay the Spire, all the prior flaws that wore you down before the fight you couldn't survive finally arrived. Think of all of the health you could have maybe preserved in those fights. Or in Darkest Dungeon, a hero falling because they took an intense amount of damage in an early fight and then the player never quite managed to fully recover it. These earlier scenarios, small or large, high roll or low roll, have consequences that can reach far into the future in a way that's hard to detect. Assessing longer lines of decisions in this way is not an easy thing to do, especially when frustrated. It's easy to get lost in the annoyance, and swings of the dice are easy to blame due to our propensity for pattern recognition. I'm not trying to blame anyone for doing so, this is a pretty natural response. But even without those things involved, it can be difficult to pick out the relevant details in a long chain of decisions and game interactions that led to a particular circumstance. There's just a whole lot to sift through, and the consequences of all of it are varied and can take time to manifest. Let's say Joseph took a stray hit he didn't need to take in a prior fight. Maybe he even registered it, that he had misplayed and took some damage needlessly. From this position, even aware of that, the neurons may not connect in such a manner that links this missing HP from the misplay to the character death. The real fun, though, is that despite this, I am certain that if you travelled back in time to this moment and asked Joseph, "Do you think you played every encounter in this dungeon optimally?" he would say no. We all would. We're all very conscious of the fact that our decisions are not fully optimal, in part due to the fact that what would even make something optimal in these game contexts is hard to assess in the first place. But this awareness is not present in the moment, or its presence is smothered by more immediate external factors. That, in this instance, the dice rolled against us. Joseph knows, either explicitly or somewhere deep down, that he didn't play every fight in the dungeon perfectly. However, he also believes that there was nothing that could have been done to save the Hellion. These two thoughts are more than likely incompatible, but neither are in the headspace at the same time. Part of this is just the nature of proficiency. At lower levels of proficiency, it's harder to even know you're making a mistake, and randomness only exacerbates this, as the consequences for a mistake vary from being rewarded for greedy play through to getting severely punished for an almost invisible misstep. Sometimes you even get punished for what should be the correct play. Like 90 times out of every 100 this play works out, but 10% of the time it doesn't. It can make these sorts of games hard to learn, as it's difficult to introspect on one's gameplay in this way. With the manifold complexities of a given game state, there's just too much to appraise. Which is why it bears reminding that this is a large part of the skill expression. The ability to view particular game actions not in isolation, but as part of a network of interlocking factors, is what makes the best players able to handle these games as well as they do. It's what makes the various decision points engaging. A more proficient player might have recognized the danger. A more proficient player may have lost less HP in prior fights. A more proficient player may have had the Hellion eat food to heal before entering the room due to an awareness of the possible danger on the other side of the door. Lord knows the game could have rolled something harder for Joseph to face. And at the end of the day, that's all I really wanted to demonstrate here. We're very prone to isolating particular swings or streaks of the dice, and to selectively appraising evidence in a way that minimizes our own agency and our fates. It's not exactly easy to see a situation like this, and instead of reacting with dismay, immediately conclude, "Ah yes, this is the 6 fights delayed punishment for my poor choice of skill use on the first round of the first fight of the dungeon," or whatever other circumstances. Even when they're more immediate, this is the consequence of me not respecting the potential danger of point-blank shot. More than anything, it seems to speak to a fixedness in how Joseph, and a lot of others, myself included, play. When we play these sorts of games, we reach fairly quick conclusions about a lot of things. What enemies are good to target first, what enemies can be left alone, what cards are good and bad, when to take shots, so on and so forth. But we can often become very fixed in these understandings in a way that doesn't respect the current game state. Adaptive thinking like that isn't easy, but a failure to adapt, or to introspect, is nothing to blame the game itself for.